The sun is barely up over the Sea of Galilee, and the smell is the first thing you would notice. Fish, salt, wet rope, wet wood. A man stands knee-deep in the cold water, hauling a net that came up almost empty, and his hands are from a lifetime of doing exactly this. He has no education that anyone would brag about. He has a temper. He has bills. He has a wife and a mother-in-law in a small stone house in a town called Capernaum, and he has absolutely no idea that he is about to become one of the most famous human beings who has ever lived. His name is Simon. In a few years, the world will call him Peter. And while he is still standing in that water, a stranger walks up the shoreline and says 2 words. Just 2. Follow me. Now here is what most people miss. The men Jesus called were not priests. They were not scholars. They were not the holy elite of their day. They were fishermen with sunburned necks. A tax collector everybody hated. A revolutionary with a knife. A skeptic who refused to believe anything he could not touch. 12 ordinary men with ordinary problems, who would go on to do something so strange that historians are still arguing about it 2,000 years later. Because nearly every one of them, by the witness of early tradition, would die for it. Not die of old age. Die badly, speared, crucified, beheaded, flayed alive. And here is the part that should keep you watching to the very end. By every account we have, not one of them ever took it back. All they had to do was take back one sentence, one claim. They only had to say, "We made it up." He's still dead, and the danger would have gone away. They didn't. As far as history records, not one of these men ever denied what he claimed to have seen. But there is a 12th man in this story who, by tradition, did not die the way the others did at all. While the others were being killed across the known world, this one grew old. He outlived all of them, and he died quietly, an old man, on a small, lonely island in the middle of the sea. Remember him. We will come back to him, because how he died matters just as much as how the others did. This is not a story about saints in stained glass. This is not a story about cold marble statues in a cathedral. This is not a story about names you memorized in Sunday school and forgot by Monday. This is a story about 12 real men, in real places, who were sent out into a dangerous world, and the reason they were sent has a name. The Greek word is apostolos. It means one who is sent. They did not start there. They started as mathits, students, learners. And by the end, every learner had become a witness who would not back down. So let's meet them. One by one, starting with the rock who sank. Start with the man in the water, Simon. Jesus looked at this loud, impulsive, unreliable fisherman and gave him a new name on the spot. He called him Kepha in Aramaic, Petros in Greek. It means rock. Think about that. He looked at the least stable man in the group and called him the steady one. It was almost a joke, because Peter was the man who said he would follow Jesus to death, and then, a few hours later, swore to a teenage servant girl in a courtyard that he had never even met him. 3 times, while a rooster crowed. If you have ever failed the one person you swore you never would, you already understand Peter. You know that specific shame. The shame that wakes you up at 3 in the morning. But that is not where Peter's story ends. After Jesus rose, he found Peter on a beach, another beach, more fish, and asked him 3 times, "Do you love me?" One question to cover each denial, and the rock was put back together. Here is what early tradition tells us happened to that man. Decades later, in the city of Rome, under the Emperor Nero, Peter was arrested and put to death the way Rome killed its enemies, by crucifixion. The early church writer Tertullian wrote about it, and there is an old account passed down through the church that Peter made one request. He asked to be crucified upside down. He said he was not worthy to die in the same position as his Lord. The man who once denied he knew Jesus at all would not even die facing the same direction. That is the rock. Now meet his brother. His name was Andrew, and he is one of the most overlooked men in the entire Bible. He was Simon Peter's brother, a fisherman too, and here is the detail people miss. Andrew was actually called first. He was the one who ran to find his brother and said, "We have found the Messiah." Andrew spent his whole life being known as Peter's brother, the supporting actor, the one in the shadow, and yet tradition says Andrew carried the message north and west, into Greece all the way to a city called Patmos. And there the old accounts say he was crucified too. on a cross of a different shape, an X rather than a T, because like his brother he did not feel worthy to die exactly as Jesus had. To this day that shape is called St. Andrew's Cross. The brother in the shadow has a cross named after him that flies on flags over entire nations. Not bad for the man nobody noticed. Stay with me because the next two were brothers as well, James and John. Jesus had a nickname for these two, Boanerges, the sons of thunder. You can guess why. They were the hot-tempered ones, the ones who once asked Jesus if they could call fire down from heaven to burn up a village that had been rude to them. Big personalities, bigger egos. Their mother once marched up to Jesus and asked if her two boys could sit at his right and left hand in the kingdom. The other 10 were furious. And James the Greater we call him, to tell him apart from the other James, would become the very first of the 12 to die. This one we do not have to take on tradition. This one is written into the Bible itself. In the book of Acts, King Herod Agrippa, grandson of the Herod who tried to kill the infant Jesus, laid violent hands on the church. And the text says simply that he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword beheaded. One sentence in Scripture. That is all the space James gets. The first son of thunder, silenced before most of the others had even left Jerusalem. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing around the same era, confirms this same Herod Agrippa was a real brutal ruler. So you and I are not in the fog of legend here. James died early, James died fast, and James died for refusing to be quiet, which brings us to his brother, John, and here is where I need you to pay attention, because John is the man I told you to remember. John was the youngest, most people think. He called himself in his own gospel simply the disciple whom Jesus loved. He was there at the cross when almost everyone else had run. He was the one Jesus trusted, with his dying breath, to take care of his own mother. And while his brother James was the first to die, John by tradition would be the last man standing. The only one of the 12 that the old accounts say was never executed. But I am getting ahead of myself. His ending is the one we save for last, and there is a reason for that, so hold his name in your mind. The brother of the first to die would somehow become the last to leave. 4 men so far, a fisherman who sank and was lifted back up, his overlooked brother with a cross on the flags of nations, a son of thunder cut down before he could finish, and a beloved disciple whose ending we are deliberately not telling you yet, and we still have 8 more to go. Before we meet the other 8, look at the pattern that is already forming. Every man we have met so far had a reason to walk away. Peter had already proven he could deny Jesus to save his own skin. James could have stayed quiet and kept his head. Not one of them did. Keep that in your mind as the count goes on. And if these forgotten stories deserve to be remembered, consider subscribing. It is the one thing that keeps a channel like this alive. And tell me in the comments, out of the 12, which disciple do you already feel like you relate to the most? I read everyone now. The forgotten 8. We know almost everything about Peter. We know almost nothing about the next several men. And here is the part nobody tells you. That silence is not a weakness in the story. It might be the strongest evidence in it. Stay with me on that. I will show you why before the end. Start with Philip, not the famous evangelist in Acts, a different Philip, one of the 12, from the same fishing town as Peter and Andrew. He was the practical one, the one doing math in his head. When Jesus asked how they could possibly feed 5,000 people, Philip immediately answered that 6 months of wages would not be enough. He was the guy in the meeting pointing at the budget. And yet tradition carries Philip far from home to a city called Hierapolis in what is now Turkey, where the old accounts say he was put to death for his preaching. The man who counted the cost paid it. Now pause for a second, because the next name on the list is one of the strangest. Bartholomew, also called Nathanael. When he first heard about Jesus of Nazareth, his reaction was almost rude. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? That was his line. He was a skeptic with an attitude, and yet this is the man whom tradition sends as a missionary across enormous distances, some accounts say as far as Armenia, even India. And the way the old accounts say he died is so brutal that artists for centuries refused to soften it. They say he was flayed, skinned alive. The doubter from the small town died, tradition holds, at the very edge of the known world, refusing to deny what he had seen. And speaking of doubters, you cannot tell this story without Thomas. We have turned his name into an insult. Doubting Thomas. But pay attention to what actually happened. When the others told him Jesus was alive, Thomas said he would not believe it until he could put his fingers in the nail wounds himself. His name, Didymos, in Greek, simply means the twin, but he became the patron saint of every honest skeptic who ever lived. And here is what most people miss about Thomas. When Jesus finally appeared and offered him those very wounds, Thomas did not just believe. He said the most direct confession of Jesus as God in the entire Gospels, "My Lord and my God." And then he did something with that belief. Tradition, and a living church in India that still bears his name today, says Thomas traveled farther than any of them, all the way to the coast of India, where he was run through with a spear near a city we now call Chennai. The man who needed to touch a wound, the old accounts say, died by one. The doubter went the farthest of all. Now hold that thought, because the next man was supposed to be a villain. Matthew. Before Jesus called him, Matthew was a tax collector, and you cannot overstate how much that mattered. A Jewish tax collector worked for the Roman occupiers. He took money from his own oppressed people and handed it to the empire, skimming his cut off the top. He was a traitor with a desk. People crossed the street to avoid him, and Jesus walked straight up to that desk and said, again, 2 words. Follow me. Matthew stood up and left the money on the table. That same traitor would go on to write the first book of the New Testament. Tradition says he was martyred far from home. Some accounts say in Ethiopia, some in Persia, but martyred all the same. The man everyone hated became the first to write the story down. Here's something historians rarely point out about the next 3 names. They are the men history almost forgot entirely. James the son of Alphaeus. We call him James the Less, just to keep him separate from the son of thunder. Thaddeus, also called Jude, who asked Jesus one quiet, beautiful question at the Last Supper. And Simon, not Peter, but Simon the Zealot. And that title should stop you cold. The Zealots were violent revolutionaries who wanted to overthrow Rome by the sword. Sitting at the same table as Simon was Matthew, who collected money for Rome. A revolutionary and a collaborator, in the same group of 12, and they did not kill each other. That alone is a small miracle. We know little about how these 3 died. The traditions are scattered: Persia, Armenia. Some say Simon was sawn in 2. And here is the honest truth I promised you. For several of these men, we simply do not have reliable early records of their deaths. And I want you to notice something strange about that. If the disciples had invented their story, you would expect 12 heroic, polished martyrdom legends, each one more dramatic than the last. Instead, for half of them, the record just goes quiet. They scatter to the ends of the earth and disappear into history, doing the one thing they were sent to do. That is not what legends look like. That is what real, ordinary men look like. Men too busy living out a mission to manage their own reputations. There is one more name before we reach the end. Matthias, you may have never heard of him. He was not one of the original 12 at all. After the betrayer fell away, the remaining 11 needed to fill the empty chair, and they chose Matthias, a man who had quietly followed Jesus the whole time without ever being in the spotlight. Tradition says even he was eventually martyred, stoned, and then beheaded. He volunteered for a seat that came with a death sentence, and he took it anyway. So that is the 12, or rather 11 and a replacement. But here is something most people never realize. The disciple who matters most to this entire question is not one of the 11 who carried the message to the end. It is the one who didn't, because there was a 13th chair at that table once, and the man who sat in it is the reason this whole story almost did not survive at all. His name was Judas Iscariot, and for 3 years he was one of them. He walked the same dusty roads. He ate from the same bowl. He watched the same miracles with his own eyes. He even held the money bag for the group. And then, for 30 pieces of silver, he handed Jesus over to the men who would kill him, with a kiss in a garden at night. Here is what makes Judas so important to this whole story. He is the control group. He is the one who proves the others. Because when Judas saw how it ended, he did not stand firm. He broke. The Gospel of Matthew says he was so consumed with regret that he threw the silver back into the temple and went out and hanged himself. The field bought with that blood money is still called, in the old accounts, the field of blood. Judas had seen everything the other 11 had seen, and under the weight of guilt, he collapsed. That is what a man does when the thing he was part of crushes him. He runs, he breaks, he ends it. Now hold Judas right next to the other 11 and watch the difference, because this is the whole point. If you have been waiting for the man I told you to remember, the brother of the first to die, the one who would somehow be the last to leave, it is time. John, the beloved disciple, while nearly every other name on this list by tradition ends in blood, a sword, a cross, a spear, a knife, John's does not. The early church writers, Irenaeus and Eusebius among them, tell us John lived to be a very old man in the city of Ephesus. The Roman authorities, the old accounts say, did try to silence him. They exiled him to a small, rocky, volcanic island in the middle of the Aegean Sea. An island called Patmos, and that part at least the Bible itself records. John writes that he was on Patmos for the word of God. And there an old man, the last living person on earth who had leaned his head against Jesus at the Last Supper, the last set of eyes that had watched him die and then seen him alive again. There on that lonely rock, John did not break the way Judas broke. He saw a vision so overwhelming that he wrote it down, and we call it the Book of Revelation. And then, tradition says, John did the one thing none of the others got to do. He grew old, he finished his work, and he died in peace. That is the man I told you to hold on to at the very beginning. The brother of the first to die became the last to leave, not by avoiding the cost, but by carrying it all the way to old age, and never once taking it back. So here is the question this whole story has been building toward, and I want you to feel the weight of it, because it is not a Sunday school question. It is a question about human nature, and you already know the answer from your own life. Think about what people actually do when they are about to die. Think about a hospital room you have sat in or one you will. Facing the end, people stop pretending. The masks come off. Nobody in their final moments clings to a lie they invented. Liars confess. Frauds crack. When the cost gets high enough, people who made something up will always take it back to save themselves. That is just who we are. Now look back at these men, scattered across the known world. Fisherman, a taxman, a doubter, a revolutionary. Not powerful, not protected. Every one of them spent the rest of his life telling the same impossible story, in a world that punished it, and as far as any record reaches, not one of them ever stood up and said, "It wasn't true. I never saw him alive." And by the witness of early tradition, many of them paid for that refusal with their lives, speared, crucified, beheaded, far from home. This is not proof that they were right. Be honest about that. People die for false beliefs all the time. But here is the line that separates the disciples from everyone else who has ever died for a cause. Most people who die for a belief die for something they were told. The disciples died for something they claimed to have seen with their own eyes, a man dead and buried, walking and eating and speaking days later. You can die for a lie you believe. It is much harder to die for a lie you know you made up. And these men who claim to have seen it firsthand never took it back. That is not a story about a number. That is not a story about a doctrine. That is not a story about stained glass. That is 12 men, and the strange, stubborn, unanimous way they refused to take it back. So before you go, let me leave you with 3 things to carry out of this. The first is simple, and it is historical. These were not myths. They were men. They had names, hometowns, jobs, tempers, and graves. They scattered into different cities in different decades, with no way to coordinate their story and every reason to recant it. And the record shows none of them ever did. That is not a feeling. That is something you can stand on. The second one is for you personally. Look again at who Jesus picked. He did not choose the qualified. He chose a fisherman with a temper, a traitor at a tax desk, a skeptic who demanded proof, a revolutionary with a grudge. Not one of them was ready. Not one of them was impressive. So if you have ever believed you were too flawed, too ordinary, too far gone to be of any use to God, You are in exactly the company he tends to choose. He never once called the qualified. He qualified the called, and the third. This is the one I want you to sit with tonight. These men did not give their lives for a teaching. They did not die for a philosophy, or a set of rules, or a beautiful idea about being kind to one another. You don't get speared at the edge of the world for an idea. You don't hang on a Roman cross for a philosophy. They gave their lives because they were convinced, all the way down to the bone, that they had watched a man die, and then shared breakfast with him on a beach 3 days later. They didn't die for a story they had heard. They died for a face they had seen. So let me ask you, and I really do want your answer. Out of all 12, Peter on his upside-down cross, Andrew's ex Thomas at the end of a spear, John alone and old on his island, which one hit you the hardest? And which of these men, if you are honest, do you actually see yourself in? Tell me down in the comments. I read them and I will reply. 12 ordinary men, one impossible claim, and not one of them, given every chance in the world to save his own life, was ever recorded taking it back. Maybe that is worth thinking about.